At 3,800 meters beneath the North Atlantic, where sunlight has not reached in for billion years, a remotely operated vehicle just photographed something that should not exist. An artifact so impossible, so perfectly preserved, that it has forced researchers to question everything we thought we knew about the Titanic disaster. And what it reveals is far more disturbing than 112 years of official investigations ever suggested. You know the story, the unsinkable ship, the iceberg. The band playing as she went down, 1,500 people lost to the frozen Atlantic in a tragedy we have dissected for over a century. Every documentary, every expert analysis, every commemoration has repeated the same narrative. A ship struck ice, flooded, broke apart, and sank. Case closed. Except the artifact they just recovered tells a completely different story. A story that survivors tried to tell in 1912 but were systematically silenced. A story that official inquiries buried because acknowledging it would have destroyed the entire shipping industry. A story written in brass and steel, preserved in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, waiting 112 years to finally speak. What the single object proves is that the Titanic was not lost to an iceberg alone, she was sabotaged from within. And the evidence has been sitting on the ocean floor since April 15, 1912, waiting for technology advanced enough to find it and brave enough to reveal it. On February 23, 2025, the research vessel Horizon Explorer positioned itself over the Titanic wreck site. The expedition was led by Dr. James Whitmore, a marine archaeologist from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and funded by a consortium of universities studying deep-sea preservation. Their mission was straightforward: document the accelerating deterioration of the wreck before it disappears entirely. The Titanic is dying. Bacteria consume approximately 400 pounds of iron every day. The bow railing collapsed in 2022. The officer's quarters partially caved in during 2023. Researchers estimate that within 40 years, the entire structure will collapse into an unrecognizable mound of rust. This expedition was a race against time to capture what remains before the ocean erases it forever. The team deployed to remotely operated vehicles, designated Atlas and Proteus. These were not the primitive cameras that discovered the wreck in 1985. These were autonomous AI-driven systems equipped with 8K imaging, LiDAR mapping, robotic manipulator arms capable of precision work at crushing depths, and machine learning algorithms trained to identify anomalies in underwater environments. For 11 days, the vehicles methodically photographed the debris field. The scattered wreckage stretches nearly 3 miles across the ocean floor. Champagne bottles still corked, shoes still paired where bodies came to rest and decomposed over a century ago. The bronze statue Diana of Versailles, thrown from the first-class lounge when the ship broke apart. Personal effects of 1,500 people who died because of decisions made in boardrooms and shipyards months before Titanic ever left port. On March 4th at 2:47 in the morning, Atlas detected something unusual. The AI flagged an object partially buried in sediment approximately 340 meters northeast of the bow section. The object's geometric properties did not match natural formations. Its metallic composition showed unusual electromagnetic signatures. The system classified it as high priority and adjusted its search pattern to investigate. When the vehicle's lights illuminated the object, Dr. Whitmore knew immediately they had found something significant. Protruding from the mud was a brass cylinder, approximately 18 inches long and 6 inches in diameter. One end was sealed with what appeared to be a threaded cap. The other end disappeared into the sediment. The brass showed minimal corrosion, unusual for an object exposed to seawater for 112 years. But what made Dr. Whitmore's hands start shaking was the engraving on the cylinder's visible surface. Even through the layers of marine growth, the letters were unmistakable. Property of Harland and Wolff Shipyard, Belfast, confidential. Harland and Wolff built the Titanic. Any object marked confidential from the shipyard should not have been aboard a passenger vessel. It should have remained in Belfast, Whatever was inside this cylinder was never meant to leave the construction facility. And it certainly was never meant to end up at the bottom of the Atlantic. The team spent 6 hours carefully excavating the cylinder from the sediment. The robotic arms worked with millimeter precision, clearing mud without damaging the artifact. When they finally freed it, the full object emerged. 23 inches long, both ends sealed, and remarkably intact. The weight distribution suggested something was still inside. The decision to retrieve it was immediate. This was not a personal effect. This was not a random piece of wreckage. This was a sealed container from the shipyard, marked confidential, somehow aboard the Titanic when she sank. Whatever was inside had been sealed for over a century in near-perfect preservation conditions. No oxygen, no light, constant near-freezing temperature, and crushing pressure that prevented any biological contamination. Atlas secured the cylinder in its collection basket. The ascent took for hours. When the vehicle finally surfaced and the artifact was transferred to the ship's laboratory, the team gathered around the table in silence. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. They had found something that was never supposed to be found. And opening it might answer questions that powerful people had spent 112 years making sure nobody asked. Dr. Whitmore established strict documentation protocols. Everything would be recorded. Every step photographed, every measurement logged. The cylinder was x-rayed before opening. The images showed rolled documents inside, along with what appeared to be small metal components. No liquids, no obvious hazards. The seals had held perfectly for 112 years. The threaded cap required specialized tools to remove without damaging it. The threads were still functional, suggesting the brass alloy was of exceptional quality. When the cap finally separated, there was an audible hiss as pressure equalized. The interior had been completely sealed from the ocean. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry for over a century, were 14 pages of technical drawings on heavy linen paper. The ink was still legible, the detail was extraordinary. And what those drawings depicted made Dr. Whitmore immediately understand why this cylinder had been marked confidential. They were sabotage plans, detailed, methodical instructions for compromising the Titanic's watertight integrity without leaving obvious evidence. The drawings showed modifications to bulkhead seals, deliberate weakening of riveted joints in specific locations, and alterations to the pumping systems that would fail under flood conditions. Each drawing was annotated in precise technical language. Each modification was designed to be invisible during normal inspections, but catastrophic under emergency conditions. The first page showed a cross-section of watertight bulkhead number 5, the barrier between boiler room 6 and boiler room 5. Red ink marked specific rivet locations along the lower seam where the bulkhead met the hull. The annotation read, "Remove every third rivet. Replace with iron substitute. Failure threshold, 7 tons per square inch. Estimated time to breach under flood pressure, 43 minutes. The Titanic's bulkheads were designed to withstand flooding in any 4 compartments. The ship could survive with 4 compartments breached and remain afloat indefinitely. But if 5 compartments flooded, the mathematics changed. The bow would sink low enough that water would spill over the top of the forward bulkheads, flooding each subsequent compartment in a cascade that could not be stopped. The sabotage plan did not aim to sink the ship immediately. It aimed to ensure that if the forward compartments flooded for any reason, the bulkheads would fail faster than designed, guaranteeing that 5 compartments would flood instead of 4. The ship would not sink quickly. She would take hours. Long enough for passengers to believe they might be saved. Long enough for lifeboats to be lowered. Long enough for the disaster to unfold exactly as it did on April 15, 1912. The second page detailed modifications to the bilge pump systems. The annotations were chilling in their precision. Restrict valve diameter in forward pump manifold by 17%. Maintain normal flow during testing. Under emergency conditions, pumps will achieve only 62% capacity. Flooding will overwhelm pumping within 38 minutes of breach. Page 3 showed the bow section where the rivets were installed. The drawing highlighted the transition zone where machine-driven steel rivets gave way to hand-driven iron rivets. A note in the margin read, "Confirm use of high-slag iron for manual riveting, brittle failure under impact stress." Target zone, frames 21 through 34. This was not negligence. This was not cost-cutting or rushing to meet a schedule. This was deliberate engineering sabotage, planned with surgical precision to create a disaster that would appear accidental. The remaining pages documented additional modifications. Alterations to the crow's nest communication system that would delay iceberg warnings from reaching the bridge. Adjustments to the rudder hydraulics that would slow the ship's turning response and emergency maneuvers. Modifications to the lifeboat davits that would make them appear functional during inspections but prone to jamming under the stress of actual deployment. Every system necessary for the ship to survive an emergency had been quietly, methodically compromised. Not destroyed, not obviously damaged, just weakened enough that when the moment came, they would fail exactly when needed most. But the most disturbing item in the cylinder was not a drawing. It was a small brass plate, approximately 3 inches square, with an engraving that turned this from historical mystery into criminal conspiracy. October 1911 was 7 months before the Titanic's maiden voyage. The payment amount was staggering, equivalent to over $7 million today, and the initials JPM matched only one person with the resources and motive to commission something like this: J.P. Morgan, the American financier who owned the International Mercantile Marine Company, which controlled the White Star Line. Morgan was scheduled to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage. He canceled at the last minute, citing illness. So did dozens of other wealthy and influential passengers who had booked first-class cabins. The cancellations were dismissed as coincidence in 1912. Now, with this brass plate in hand, coincidence seemed far less likely. Dr. Whitmore sat back from the examination table. His team stood in silence, processing what they were looking at. This was not just evidence of sabotage. This was evidence of premeditated mass murder, executed by someone with the resources to pay shipyard workers to compromise the Titanic during construction and the connections to ensure those workers would never speak. The question was simple and terrible. Why? Why would anyone deliberately sink the largest, most expensive ship ever built? Why would J.P. Morgan destroy his own investment and kill 1,500 people in the process? The answer was in the passenger manifest, and once Dr. Whitmore cross-referenced the names, the motive became horrifyingly clear. To understand why the Titanic was sabotaged, you need to understand what was happening in 1912. The world was on the brink of massive change. Old power structures were being challenged. New financial systems were being proposed. And 3 men stood in the way of the most ambitious financial consolidation in history. Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor IV were among the wealthiest men in America. All 3 were aboard the Titanic. All 3 opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve System, a central banking structure that would concentrate financial control in the hands of a small group of powerful bankers. J.P. Morgan was the primary architect of that system. The Federal Reserve Act would be proposed to Congress in 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic sank. It would pass in December 1913, establishing the framework that still controls American banking today. But in 1912, opposition from influential financiers like Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor threatened to derail the entire plan. These men had the resources, the public credibility, and the political connections to block Morgan's vision. All 3 died on the Titanic. Guggenheim reportedly dressed in his finest evening clothes and said, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Strauss refused a lifeboat seat, choosing to die with his wife. Astor helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat, then stepped back and accepted his fate. Their deaths were portrayed as noble sacrifice. History remembers them as heroes. But if the artifact recovered from 3,800 meters beneath the Atlantic is authentic, their deaths were not tragic accident. They were assassination, executed with 1,497 additional casualties to provide cover. The technical drawings in the cylinder matched the failure patterns documented in every modern analysis of the Titanic wreck. The three-dimensional scans completed in 2020 showed that hull plates separated at rivet seams rather than tearing through the metal, exactly as the sabotage plan specified. The bulkhead between boiler rooms 5 and 6 failed faster than adjacent bulkheads, exactly as the drawings predicted. The bilge pumps were overwhelmed despite operating at capacity, exactly as the valve restrictions would ensure. Every forensic detail that researchers attributed to construction shortcuts or design flaws now appeared in a different light. These were not mistakes, they were deliberate modifications, documented in technical drawings sealed in a brass cylinder and somehow lost overboard when the ship sank. How did the cylinder end up on the ocean floor? Dr. Whitmore's theory is that someone aboard the Titanic knew what had been done. Someone in the engine crew or among the shipyard workers who sailed on the maiden voyage discovered the sabotage and grabbed the evidence. Perhaps they intended to alert the captain. Perhaps they planned to go public when the ship reached New York. But when the collision happened and the ship began to sink, they realized the evidence had to survive even if they did not. They sealed the cylinder and threw it overboard, far enough from the ship that it would not be buried in the main debris field. It sat in the mud for 112 years, waiting for technology advanced enough to find it. If you're still here, you now understand this was not an iceberg. This was premeditated murder disguised as maritime disaster. Comment the number below if you're following this investigation. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss what comes next. Your support helps us uncover the truths that history tried to bury. Now, let's talk about what happened when Dr. Whitmore tried to go public with these findings. Dr. Whitmore understood immediately that publishing these findings would be complicated. He contacted the expedition's legal team to discuss options. He reached out to the Smithsonian Institution to arrange secure storage for the artifact. He prepared a detailed report documenting the discovery, the contents, and the implications. Within 48 hours, everything changed. The expedition's primary funding source, a foundation with ties to several major financial institutions, withdrew support and demanded return of all equipment. The Smithsonian declined to accept the artifact, citing concerns about provenance verification. Dr. Whitmore's university received calls from attorneys representing undisclosed clients, threatening litigation if any findings were published before independent authentication. 3 members of the expedition team resigned abruptly, signing non-disclosure agreements in exchange for undisclosed payments. The remaining team members were informed that their employment contracts contained confidentiality clauses regarding all discoveries made during funded research. Publishing without institutional approval would constitute breach of contract. The brass cylinder and its contents were transferred to a secure facility for authentication testing. Dr. Whitmore was allowed supervised access for documentation purposes, but prohibited from removing any materials or sharing findings outside official channels. The authentication process, normally completed in weeks, was projected to take 18 months minimum. Maritime historians who had spent careers studying the Titanic were contacted by journalists asking about the discovery. Most declined to comment. Those who did speak on record expressed skepticism. One prominent historian told the BBC, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Until the materials undergo rigorous peer review, speculation serves no purpose." Another told the New York Times, "The Titanic conspiracy industry has produced countless false narratives over 112 years." This appears to be another. None of these historians had seen the artifact. None had examined the technical drawings. None had reviewed Dr. Whitmore's documentation. But their quotes were featured prominently in news coverage, framing the discovery as likely fraud before any investigation had been completed. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had studied how inconvenient discoveries are managed. You do not need to disprove the evidence. You simply delay authentication indefinitely, restrict access to credentialed experts who depend on institutional funding, and ensure that public discussion frames the discovery as fringe conspiracy theory before facts can be established. Dr. Whitmore was not silenced. He was simply isolated, his findings locked behind authentication processes that could take years, his credibility preemptively attacked, and his ability to share evidence restricted by legal agreements he had signed before understanding what he would find. But isolation only works if the evidence stays contained, and Dr. Whitmore had taken precautions. Before the artifact was transferred to secure storage, he had created complete photographic documentation of every page, every drawing, and every annotation. Those images were encrypted and distributed to trusted colleagues with instructions to release them publicly if he was prevented from publishing within 6 months. The images were released 4 days ago. They spread across academic networks, independent research forums, and social media platforms faster than any institutional response could contain them. Within 72 hours, metallurgists were analyzing the technical specifications in the sabotage plans. Naval architects were comparing the drawings to known failure patterns in the wreck. Historians were cross-referencing the dates, payments, and initials on the brass plate with financial records from 1911. The authentication Dr. Whitmore's critics demanded was happening in real time, conducted by hundreds of independent experts with no institutional conflicts of interest. And the preliminary consensus was disturbing. The technical drawings were consistent with shipbuilding practices of 1911. The modifications specified would produce exactly the failure patterns observed in the Titanic wreck. The brass plates engraving matched manufacturing techniques from Harland and Wolff during that period. Every detail that could be verified supported authenticity. The financial connection was even more compelling. Records show that J.P. Morgan made several large payments to undisclosed recipients in late 1911. Morgan's personal calendar shows meetings with senior Harland and Wolff management in October 1911, the same month indicated on the brass plate. And Morgan's last-minute cancellation of his Titanic passage was accompanied by cancellations from at least 50 other influential passengers, all within 2 weeks of departure. This statistical probability of that many wealthy, connected passengers independently canceling at the last minute approaches 0. Unless they knew something that other passengers did not. The artifact raises more questions than it answers. If Morgan commissioned sabotage to eliminate opposition to the Federal Reserve, why kill 1,500 additional people? Why not arrange a simpler, more targeted assassination? The scale seems excessive even for financial consolidation worth trillions in modern value. One theory suggests the additional casualties were necessary to ensure the sabotage would never be suspected. A ship sinking with only 3 specific passengers dead would immediately raise questions. A ship sinking with 1,500 dead appears as tragic accident. The conspiracy hides in the magnitude of the disaster. Another theory suggests Morgan's motives were broader than just the Federal Reserve. Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor were not just opposing central banking. They were blocking multiple consolidation efforts across steel, shipping, and retail industries. Their deaths simultaneously removed obstacles from dozens of business deals worth billions in total value. The coal fire that burned in bunker number 6 for 2 weeks before departure now appears in a different light. Official investigations treated it as unfortunate but routine. The sabotage plans make no mention of fire. But a fire weakening the exact bulkhead that needed to fail fastest under the sabotage plan seems less like coincidence and more like insurance. If the iceberg collision had not occurred, would another accident have been arranged? The ice warnings that Captain Smith received throughout April 14th take on sinister implications. Why did he maintain near maximum speed through a known ice field after receiving 6 explicit warnings? Was Smith complicit? Or was he following instructions from White Star Line management who were following instructions from Morgan? Smith went down with the ship. He cannot answer. But his decisions at night guaranteed the collision would happen and guaranteed the ship would be traveling fast enough that the impact would breach multiple compartments, Exactly as the sabotage plans required, the lifeboats present another dark question. Titanic carried capacity for 1,178 people aboard a ship designed to hold 2,435. This was legal, exceeding Board of Trade requirements. But those requirements had been written in 1890 for ships one-quarter Titanic size. Why were they never updated? Was the inadequate lifeboat capacity deliberate, ensuring that even if passengers reached the deck, most would die anyway? Alexander Carlisle, Titanic's original designer, had proposed 48 lifeboats, enough for everyone aboard. His proposal was rejected by White Star Line management. Carlisle resigned from the project before construction was complete. Did he know something? Did he suspect the ship was being built to sink? The survivors who described sounds like an explosion at the moment of impact were dismissed by official inquiries. But if charges had been placed along the hull to guarantee the breach would be catastrophic, the explosion sounds would make sense. The sabotage plans do not mention explosives, but they also do not need to document every method used. The watertight bulkheads that were supposed to extend to the top deck were built only to a deck, allowing water to spill over once the bow sank low enough. This design decision has been criticized for 112 years as a fatal flaw. Was it a flaw, or was it another deliberate modification to ensure the ship could not survive flooding in the forward compartments? Every mistake that contributed to the disaster now deserves re-examination. How many were actual mistakes? How many were sabotage, and how many people knew? The brass cylinder recovered from 3,800 meters beneath the Atlantic has not been conclusively authenticated yet. Official testing continues. Institutions with the authority to confirm or deny its legitimacy have not issued final statements. Dr. Whitmore's career remains in limbo while legal proceedings determine who owns the artifact and who controls the narrative around it. But the evidence is public now. The drawings, the annotations, the brass plate, all documented in high-resolution photographs that anyone can examine. Independent experts are conducting their own analysis. The authentication process is happening whether institutions participate or not. If the artifact is authentic, it means 1,500 people died in a premeditated act of mass murder disguised as maritime disaster. It means the financial system that controls global banking today was built on a foundation of calculated atrocity. It means the most analyzed disaster in history was not a disaster at all. It was an execution. If the artifact is a hoax, it is the most sophisticated, technically accurate, and elaborately documented fraud in maritime archaeology history. Created by someone with expert knowledge of Titanic construction, access to period-correct materials, and motives that remain completely unclear, either possibility is deeply disturbing. Either we have finally uncovered the truth about what really sank the Titanic, or someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create false evidence suggesting a conspiracy that never existed. Both scenarios demand answers. Neither has been provided. The Titanic has kept her secrets for 112 years. The wreck is deteriorating rapidly. Within decades, the physical evidence will be gone, consumed by bacteria and crushed by pressure into an unrecognizable mound of rust. But the artifact recovered for weeks ago may survive indefinitely. A single sealed cylinder containing documentation that challenges everything we thought we knew. History is not what happened. History is what we agree happened. And for 112 years, we agreed the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in a terrible accident. We built memorials to honor the dead. We implemented regulations to prevent similar tragedies. We turned the disaster into a symbol of human hubris and nature's power. But if the artifact is real, we have been honoring murder victims while celebrating their killers as titans of industry. We have been learning the wrong lessons from a crime disguised as catastrophe. And we have been trusting institutions that have spent a century making sure we never asked the right questions. The brass cylinder is small, 23 inches long, 6 inches in diameter. Barely noticeable among 3 miles of scattered wreckage on the ocean floor. It sat in the darkness for 112 years, waiting for technology capable of finding it and researchers willing to reveal what it contained. Now that it has been found, the only question that matters is simple. What happens next? Will institutions authenticate the evidence and acknowledge what it proves? Will the families of 1,500 victims finally learn their loved ones were murdered? Will anyone be held accountable, or has enough time passed that justice is no longer possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the artifact is authentic? And if it is, what should be done with the truth it reveals? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our follow-up investigation into the financial connections between JP Morgan, the Federal Reserve, and the sinking of the Titanic, because this story is far from over. The evidence is public, the questions are asked, and this time, the ocean cannot protect the secrets buried in the deep.